Montana Territory, 1885. Violet skies stretched over the lonely expanse of Sweetgrass County as the last rays of summer sun painted the prairie gold. Vaughn Prescott guided his dun gelding along the eastern ridge, one hand resting loosely on his saddle horn, his lean frame silhouetted against the darkening horizon. At 25, he'd already spent more years in the saddle than most men twice his age, the endless miles etched into his sun-bronzed face despite his youth. His clear blue eyes scanned the landscape with the vigilance that had kept him alive through 7 years of driving cattle, fighting rustlers, and surviving the unforgiving wilderness. The rolling grasslands had taught him one undeniable truth: a man rides alone in this world. Friends became memories, partnerships dissolved, and promises broke as easily as dry kindling. The frontier demanded solitude as payment for survival, and Vaughn had long ago accepted this bargain. His parents' homestead had fallen to drought and fever when he was 16, leaving him nothing but his father's saddle, a decent horse, and the conviction that attachment was the quickest path to ruin. A skilled horseman and respected for his steady hand with cattle, Vaughn found work easily enough with the large outfits pushing herds north from Texas. But he never wintered in the same bunkhouse twice, never called any man partner beyond a season's work. The transient life suited him, or so he told himself as he stared into countless solitary campfires beneath star-filled skies. Tonight, though, as he guided his horse along the ridgeline toward the distant lights of Cottonwood Springs, something hollow echoed inside him. The cattle drive had ended 3 days back, the herd delivered to the railroad in Miles City. The other drovers had stayed to spend their wages on whiskey and women, but Vaughn had collected his pay and ridden out, uncomfortable with the boisterous camaraderie that followed a successful drive. Now, with winter approaching and no prospects lined up, he faced the familiar emptiness of another transition. He'd heard talk of ranch work west of Cottonwood Springs, a small spread looking for experienced hands to help them through the winter. It would do until spring brought new opportunities. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of smoke and the distant lowing of cattle. Vaughn paused, standing in his stirrups to peer across the darkening valley. That's when he saw her. She walked alone along the rutted wagon road, her dark blue skirt billowing slightly in the evening breeze. A small valise clutched in one hand, she moved with purpose despite her obvious exhaustion. Even from a distance, Vaughn could see the rigid determination in her posture, a woman who would not be defeated by circumstance, however dire. Something about her solitary figure against the vast landscape made him rein his horse to a stop. Travelers didn't wander these roads alone at dusk, especially not women. Cottonwood Springs lay at least 4 miles ahead and darkness was falling fast. Prudence dictated he mind his own business. The frontier was littered with the graves of men who'd inserted themselves into others' troubles. Yet he found himself turning his horse down the slope toward the road, an inexplicable urgency guiding him forward. As he approached, she heard his horse's hoofbeats and turned, tensing visibly. Her hand moved to her side, searching for a weapon, he realized, though whether she carried one remained uncertain. The dying light revealed a young woman of perhaps 20, her chestnut hair partially escaping from a practical bun. Her face, though smudged with dust from the road, held a striking beauty that even exhaustion couldn't diminish. But it was her eyes that captured Vaughn's attention, large, amber-brown, and filled with a fierce intelligence that assessed him instantly as potential threat or salvation. He stopped his horse at a respectful distance, removing his hat. "Evening, miss," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Cottonwood Springs is a fair piece away yet, night's coming on fast." She straightened, chin lifting slightly. Her dress, though travel-worn, was of good quality, navy blue with delicate stitching at the collar. "Not a homesteader's daughter or a farm girl, then. I'm well aware of the distance, thank you," she replied, her voice carrying a hint of eastern refinement beneath the weariness. "I had arranged for transport, but it seems my driver had other priorities once paid." Vaughn nodded, understanding immediately. Such swindles were common enough: take payment, deliver passengers halfway, then abandon them with excuses of broken wheels or lame horses. "Where are you headed in Cottonwood?" he asked, still keeping his distance, aware of how his presence might appear to a woman alone on this desolate road. She hesitated, clearly weighing whether to share such information with a stranger. "I've taken a position as the new schoolteacher," she finally said. Vaughn nodded. He'd heard the town had sent for one, the previous teacher having married a cattle buyer and moved east last spring. "Name's Vaughn Prescott," he offered. "Just finished a drive up from Wyoming. I can vouch for myself with Marshal Donovan in town if needed." Something in his straightforward manner seemed to ease her wariness slightly. "Lillian O'Connor," she replied after a moment. The darkening sky and distant howl of a coyote made the decision for them both. Vaughn glanced at the gathering dusk, then back to her. "Miss O'Connor, night comes quick out here, and it's no place for walking alone. Would you ride with me to town? I give you my word as a gentleman, you'll come to no harm." Her eyes studied him, taking in his worn but clean clothes, the absence of liquor on his breath, the respectful distance he maintained. "And if I refuse?" she asked directly. "Then I'd tip my hat, wish you well, and ride alongside at a distance until you reached town safely," he answered honestly. "But it would ease my mind considerably if you'd accept the ride. There are wolves in these hills, and not all walk on 4 legs." Lillian glanced down the long, empty road that disappeared into growing darkness, then back at the young cowboy. Something in his clear gaze spoke of honesty she rarely encountered in her previous life back east. "Very well, Mr. Prescott," she said finally. "I accept your offer." Vaughn dismounted smoothly, approaching her with his hat still in hand. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to her valise. She relinquished it, and he secured it to his saddle before offering his hand. She hesitated only briefly before placing her gloved fingers in his palm. With surprising gentleness for a man of his profession, he helped her mount, ensuring she was seated securely before swinging up behind her. "I'll keep a proper distance, miss," he assured her, careful to leave space between them despite the constraints of the saddle. He reached around her to take the reins, creating a protective circle without pressing too close. As they set off toward Cottonwood Springs, Lillian O'Connor sat rigid at first, clearly uncomfortable with their proximity. But as the miles passed and the cowboy maintained his respectful demeanor, her posture gradually relaxed. "What brings a schoolteacher all the way out to Montana territory?" Vaughn asked, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. Lillian considered her answer carefully. "A new beginning," she said finally. "Sometimes the only way forward is to leave everything behind." Something in her tone, a careful neutrality that masked deeper emotion, resonated with Vaughn. He recognized the voice of someone running from something, or perhaps toward something equally uncertain. "The West is good for new beginnings," he replied. "No shortage of those out here." "And you, Mr. Prescott? What drives a man to wander these territories?" Vaughn was silent for a moment, unused to personal questions. "Freedom, I suppose," he answered finally. "No ties, no expectations. A man can breathe out here." "No family waiting somewhere?" she asked. "No, ma'am, lost my folks years back, been riding solo since." "That sounds lonely," she observed quietly. The simple truth of her words struck him with unexpected force. No one had called his chosen life lonely before, not directly. The men he worked with understood the transient nature of their profession, they didn't question it. "It's simpler," he replied, his voice rougher than intended. "People complicate things." "Yes," she agreed, surprising him. "They certainly do." They rode in silence after that, each lost in private thoughts as the first stars appeared overhead. The lights of Cottonwood Springs gradually emerged from the darkness, promising warmth and shelter after the long journey. As they approached the outskirts of town, Vaughn felt an unexpected reluctance to reach their destination. There was something about this woman, her quiet strength, her careful words, that intrigued him. For the first time in years, he found himself curious about another person's story. "The schoolhouse has living quarters attached, I believe," he said as they rode down the main street, passing the darkened storefronts and occasional saloons still glowing with lamplight. "Yes, that's my understanding as well," she replied. "Though I've yet to see it. Town council keeps the key at the general store. Proprietor's name is Hobson, decent sort." "The store appears closed," Lillian observed, looking at the darkened windows of Hobson's general merchandise. Vaughn frowned slightly. "Boarding house is still open. Mrs. Whittaker runs a clean place. She could put you up until morning." "I haven't budgeted for additional accommodations," Lillian admitted reluctantly. Vaughn heard what she didn't say, that her funds were limited, carefully allocated for her new life. He'd been in similar straits often enough to recognize the careful economy of someone starting over. "I know where Hobson lives," he said after a moment, "just 2 streets over. We could see if he's willing to open up for you, given the circumstances." Relief flickered across her features. "That would be very kind." 15 minutes later, a sleepy but accommodating Mr. Hobson unlocked the schoolhouse door, apologizing for the oversight. "Town council mentioned you'd be arriving tomorrow," he explained, lighting a lamp in the small attached living quarters. "Would have had it properly prepared if we'd known you'd come today." "The fault is entirely my own," Lillian assured him. "My transport arrangements changed unexpectedly." "Got abandoned halfway, more like," Vaughn added from the doorway, where he waited with her valise. "Jackson's still running that wagon service from the railhead." Hobson grimaced. "That's the one, not the first time neither. I'll tell the marshal in the morning." The living quarters were modest but clean, a small bedroom, sitting area with a cast iron stove, and a simple kitchen space. Basic furnishings included a narrow bed, a table with 2 chairs, and a rocking chair near the stove. "It's perfect," Lillian said, surveying the space with obvious relief. "Thank you for your assistance, Mr. Hobson." "Pantry's got some basic provisions," Hobson said. "Not much, mind, but enough to get you through tonight. My wife will bring over proper groceries tomorrow." After Hobson departed, Vaughn set her valise near the bedroom door. "I should be going as well," he said, suddenly aware of the impropriety of remaining in a lady's quarters after dark, regardless of the innocent circumstances. Lillian turned from examining the stove. "Mr. Prescott," she said hesitantly, "I realize I haven't properly thanked you, if you hadn't come along." She left the sentence unfinished. Vaughn shifted uncomfortably under her grateful gaze. Anyone would have done the same. "No," she said with quiet certainty. "They wouldn't have, not in my experience." Their eyes met in the lamplight, and something unspoken passed between them, recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits despite their different paths. "Will you be staying in Cottonwood Springs?" she asked. "For a spell, maybe. Heard the Sullivan Ranch is hiring for winter. Thought I'd ride out there tomorrow." Lillian nodded. "Then perhaps our paths will cross again, Mr. Prescott." "Perhaps they will, Miss O'Connor." He set his hat back on his head, touching the brim in a gesture of respect. "Good night." As he closed the door behind him, Vaughn paused on the small porch, looking up at the star-filled sky. The familiar emptiness that usually accompanied him between jobs seemed diminished somehow, replaced by an unfamiliar sensation he couldn't quite name. Shaking his head at his own foolishness, he untied his horse and led it toward the livery stable. Schoolteachers and drifting cowboys didn't share the same world, he reminded himself. By spring, he'd be gone with the trail herds again, and she'd be established in her new life here. Their paths had crossed briefly, nothing more. Yet as he settled into his rented room at the boarding house that night, Vaughn found himself wondering about the mysterious circumstances that had brought Lillian O'Connor to this remote Montana town, and what she might be running from or toward. The Sullivan Ranch lay 10 miles west of Cottonwood Springs, a modest but well-maintained cattle operation sprawled across several thousand acres of prime grazing land. Vaughn arrived mid-morning, impressed by the sturdy construction of the main house and outbuildings. This was no fly-by-night operation, but a place built to last, rare in a territory where fortunes changed with each season's whims. Ewan Sullivan, the owner, was a broad-shouldered Scotsman in his 50s with a no-nonsense demeanor that Vaughn appreciated. After a brief interview consisting mainly of practical questions about Vaughn's experience with winter cattle management and his ability to repair fence lines, Sullivan offered him the job. "Bunkhouse is down by the corral," Sullivan explained as they walked the property. "For other hands staying through winter. Cook serves 3 squares daily, Sundays off unless there's trouble with the herd. Pays $40 a month with room and board." The terms were fair, better than most, in fact. Vaughn accepted without hesitation. "Town runs a supply wagon out every Wednesday," Sullivan added. "Case you need anything." For the next 2 weeks, Vaughn settled into the rhythm of ranch work, mending fences, treating cattle for parasites before winter set in, and repairing outbuildings. The other hands were competent men who minded their business, and Vaughn found the work satisfying in its straightforward demands. Yet each Wednesday when the supply wagon returned from town, he found himself casually inquiring about Cottonwood Springs news, listening for any mention of the new schoolteacher. The brief reports that she'd started classes with 15 students ranging from 6 to 16 years of age, that she'd organized the school's first lending library, that she'd impressed the town council with her dedication, left him curiously dissatisfied, hungry for details the ranch hands couldn't provide. On the third Sunday after his arrival, Vaughn found himself riding into Cottonwood Springs, telling himself he merely needed to replenish his tobacco supply. The general store was closed for the Sabbath, but the church service was just concluding as he tied his horse at the hitching post outside the small whitewashed building serving as the town's social center. Families streamed from the doors, women in their Sunday best and men in carefully brushed coats, children temporarily subdued by the solemn occasion. Vaughn hung back, uncomfortable with the crowd, then he saw her. Lillian O'Connor stood on the church steps, engaged in conversation with an older couple. Dressed in a simple but elegant dark green dress, her chestnut hair arranged more elaborately than during their first meeting, she looked every inch the respectable schoolteacher. Several children hovered nearby, clearly eager for her attention even on a Sunday. Something in Vaughn's chest tightened at the sight. She belonged here among these decent townspeople with their ordered lives and permanent homes. What had he been thinking, riding into town as if? She looked up then, her gaze finding his across the churchyard with surprising directness. Recognition flickered in her eyes, followed by something that might have been pleasure. Excusing herself from the couple, she made her way toward him. "Mr. Prescott," she greeted him, her voice warming the crisp autumn air. "What a pleasant surprise." "Miss O'Connor," he removed his hat, suddenly aware of his work clothes and the trail dust still clinging to his boots despite his best efforts. "Hope you're settling in well." "Very well, thank you," her smile reached her eyes. "I understand I have you to thank for my position here in a way." Vaughn's brow furrowed in confusion. "Mr. Sullivan mentioned you spoke highly of my academic qualifications when you took the ranch position," she explained. "His daughter is among my older students." Vaughn felt heat rising to his face. He'd said no such thing, had barely mentioned their meeting to Sullivan beyond explaining how he came to be in town. The rancher must have drawn his own conclusions and embellished the connection. "I wouldn't presume to speak on matters of education," he said carefully. Lillian's smile turned knowing. "Nevertheless, I appreciate that you apparently made a favorable impression regarding my character. It means a great deal in a small community." Before Vaughn could formulate a response, a tall, well-dressed man approached, inserting himself into their conversation with practiced ease. "Miss O'Connor, your sermon notes were most insightful," the man said, barely acknowledging Vaughn's presence. "I particularly enjoyed your observations on the parable's application to modern community building." "Thank you, Mr. Hargrove. I'm glad you found them useful." Lillian's tone remained pleasant but cooled noticeably. "May I introduce Mr. Vaughn Prescott? Mr. Prescott, this is Edward Hargrove, our bank manager." Hargrove gave Vaughn a cursory nod, his assessment of the Cowboy's worth clearly registered in seconds. "Prescott," he acknowledged briskly before turning back to Lillian. "I was hoping you might join my sister and me for Sunday dinner, Miss O'Connor. She's most eager to continue your discussion about the literary society." "That's very kind," Lillian replied, "but I've already promised Mrs. Whittaker I would dine with her today, perhaps another time." Disappointment flashed across Hargrove's features before he composed himself. "Of course, another time." With a final dismissive glance at Vaughn, he retreated to join an equally well-dressed woman waiting nearby. "The bank manager seems quite attentive," Vaughn observed once Hargrove was out of earshot. Lillian's expression revealed nothing. "Mr. Hargrove has been very welcoming since my arrival." "I imagine most of the town has," Vaughn said, noting how several people continued to glance their way with undisguised curiosity. "It's a friendly community," she agreed, then added more softly, "though I confess I sometimes find the constant attention rather overwhelming. Everyone seems quite invested in the new schoolteacher's business." Understanding dawned. In a small town like Cottonwood Springs, the unmarried schoolteacher would be subject to endless scrutiny, her every movement, acquaintance, and habit catalogued and discussed at length. "Must make it hard to catch your breath," Vaughn said. Something in his tone made her look at him sharply, as if surprised by his perception. Yes, she admitted, exactly that. An idea formed in Vaughn's mind, impulsive and probably foolish, but compelling nonetheless. Would you like to go for a ride? He asked suddenly. Away from town, there's a view from the eastern ridge that's worth seeing. Lillian blinked, clearly startled by the invitation. Now. But it's Sunday and I'm hardly dressed for riding. Next Sunday then, Vaughn suggested, surprising himself with his persistence, if you'd like a few hours away from watchful eyes. He expected her to refuse politely, to explain that such an excursion would be improper, especially with a man she barely knew. Instead, after a moment's consideration, she nodded. Yes, she said simply, I would like that very much. They made arrangements to meet the following Sunday afternoon, after church services. As Vaughn mounted his horse to return to the ranch, he wondered what had possessed him to issue such an invitation, and why, against all reason, she had accepted. The week passed with agonizing slowness. Vaughn found himself watching the horizon each evening, marking the sun's position and calculating the days remaining until Sunday. The other ranch hands noticed his distraction, exchanging knowing glances when he took extra care with his appearance on the appointed day. "Got yourself a town girl, Prescott?" asked Miller, the oldest of the hands, as Vaughn shaved carefully before a small mirror. "Just meeting a friend," Vaughn replied, unwilling to subject Lillian's reputation to bunkhouse speculation. Miller snorted knowingly, but said nothing more. Vaughn arrived in town just as the church service ended, having timed his journey to avoid sitting through the sermon while still appearing promptly for their arrangement. He'd worn his best shirt, a blue cotton flannel reserved for rare visits to civilization, and his least worn pair of denims. His black hat, brushed free of dust, completed the modest attempt at respectability. Lillian emerged from the church looking momentarily uncertain until she spotted him waiting with 2 horses, his own dun gelding and a gentle mare borrowed from the Sullivan Ranch. Her face brightened with what appeared to be relief, and she made her excuses to the church ladies before walking toward him. She had dressed practically for the occasion in a simple riding skirt of dark brown wool and a cream-colored shirtwaist. A small leather satchel was slung over her shoulder. "I brought lunch," she explained, seeing his glance. "Nothing elaborate, just some bread, cheese, and apples from Mrs. Whittaker's kitchen." That was thoughtful, Vaughn said, genuinely touched by the gesture. He hadn't considered the need for provisions, accustomed as he was to going without regular meals on the trail. He helped her mount the mare, noting how she settled comfortably in the saddle. "You've ridden before," he observed. "My father kept horses in Pennsylvania," she replied. "Though it's been some years since I had regular opportunity to ride." They set out eastward, away from town, conscious of the curious stares following their departure. Once past the last outbuildings, Vaughn felt Lillian's posture relax beside him. "Thank you for this," she said quietly. "I didn't realize how much I needed to escape until you offered the opportunity." "Town can close in on a person," Vaughn agreed, guiding them toward a game trail that wound up toward the ridge. "Out here, a body can hear themselves think." The autumn day was perfect for riding, cool enough to be comfortable, with a clear sky stretching endlessly above the golden prairie grass. As they climbed gradually toward the ridgeline, Vaughn pointed out features of the landscape: a distant herd of pronghorn antelope, the silvery ribbon of creek that would freeze solid by December, the ancient cottonwoods marking underground springs. Lillian proved to be an attentive listener and a capable writer, asking intelligent questions about the seasonal patterns of the land. There was something refreshing about her curiosity, her genuine interest in understanding this place she now called home. They reached the ridge by mid-afternoon, dismounting at a flat outcropping of rock that offered a sweeping view of the valley below. Cottonwood Springs was visible as a tiny collection of buildings nestled against the creek, while the Sullivan Ranch appeared as a distant cluster of structures to the west. "It's breathtaking," Lillian said, gazing across the expansive landscape. "One feels very small against such vastness." "That's the truth of it," Vaughn agreed, loosening the horses' girths to let them rest comfortably. "Makes a man's troubles seem smaller, too." They spread her simple lunch on a flat rock, sitting side by side as they ate and talked. For the first time in years, Vaughn found conversation coming easily. He told her about the cattle drives, the changing seasons on the prairie, the skills needed to survive the harsh Montana winters. She listened with genuine interest, asking questions that revealed a quick intelligence and practical mind. "And before you came west," she asked eventually, "you mentioned losing your parents young." Vaughn nodded, surprised to find himself willing to speak of it. "Farm in Nebraska, nothing fancy, wheat mostly, some cattle. Drought took the crops 3 years running, then fever took my folks. I was 16, no kin nearby. Sold what was left for enough to buy a decent saddle, and joined a cattle outfit heading north." "I'm sorry," she said simply. "That's a heavy burden for a young man to bear alone." Something in her tone, not pity but genuine understanding, loosened a knot he'd carried so long he'd forgotten its presence. "What about you?" he asked. "What brings a Pennsylvania girl all the way to Montana territory to teach school?" Lillian was silent for a long moment, looking out across the valley. Just as Vaughn began to regret the question, she spoke. "I was engaged," she said quietly, "to the son of my father's business partner. The match made perfect sense, our families moved in the same circles, Charles had excellent prospects, and I had been properly educated to become a suitable wife." She paused, absently tracing patterns in the dust beside her. "3 weeks before the wedding, I discovered Charles had been involved with another woman, a widow with connections to several prominent families. When confronted, he informed me quite calmly that while our marriage would proceed as planned, as it was beneficial to both families, I should understand that his affections lay elsewhere. He expected me to accept this arrangement with proper dignity." Vaughn felt a surge of anger on her behalf. "Sounds like a real gentleman," he said, not bothering to hide the contempt in his voice. A small, sad smile crossed Lillian's face. "The truly devastating part was my father's reaction when I broke the engagement. He was furious, not with Charles, but with me. He said I was being childish and unrealistic, that marriages of our class were built on practicality, not romantic notions. He gave me a choice, reconcile with Charles or be cut off entirely." "So you left," Vaughn said, understanding dawning. She nodded. "I had some savings of my own and my teaching credentials. I saw the advertisement for Cottonwood Springs and applied immediately. By the time my father realized I was serious, I was already on the train west." The courage such a decision required impressed Vaughn deeply. To leave everything familiar, to travel alone across the country rather than accept a loveless marriage, it spoke of a strength of character he hadn't expected. "That took real grit," he said. "Most would have buckled under that kind of pressure." "Many days I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake," she admitted, "especially when I found myself abandoned on that road at dusk." Their eyes met and something shifted between them, an understanding, a recognition of shared experience despite their different paths. Both had faced moments when life offered no good choices, only the necessity of moving forward alone. "I'm glad I was riding that ridge that evening," Vaughn said quietly. "As am I," she replied, her voice equally soft. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken possibility. Then a distant roll of thunder broke the silence, and both looked up to see dark clouds gathering on the western horizon. "Storm coming," Vaughn observed, rising to his feet. "We should head back." They packed the remains of their lunch quickly, tightening the horses' girths in preparation for the return journey. As they mounted, the first gusts of wind reached them, carrying the scent of rain. "Will we beat it back to town?" Lillian asked, eyeing the approaching clouds with concern. "Not likely," Vaughn admitted. "But there's a line shack about halfway, part of the Sullivan property. We can shelter there if needed." They rode swiftly but carefully down from the ridge, the horses sensing the approaching storm and moving with purpose. The temperature dropped noticeably as the clouds overtook the sun, casting the landscape in premature twilight. The first heavy raindrops began to fall when they were still a good 3 miles from town. Within minutes, the drizzle transformed into a proper downpour, the kind of sudden autumn storm that swept across the plains without warning. "This way," Vaughn called over the increasing roar of the rain, guiding them toward a small structure nestled in a stand of cottonwoods near the creek. The line shack was a simple one-room cabin used by ranch hands monitoring distant pastures, stocked with basic provisions and firewood. They reached it just as the storm reached its full intensity, dismounting quickly and leading the horses to the lean-to shelter attached to one side of the cabin. Vaughn helped Lillian dismount, her hands cold and wet in his as she slid from the saddle. Inside, he urged, opening the cabin door. I'll see to the horses. By the time he had unsaddled both animals and ensured they were secured under the shelter, Vaughn was thoroughly soaked. He entered the cabin to find Lillian had already located the supplies and started a small fire in the iron stove. There are some dry blankets in that trunk, she said, gesturing to a wooden chest against one wall. And coffee, though no fresh milk, of course. The single room was spare but adequate, a small table with 2 chairs, a narrow cot against one wall, the iron stove, and shelves stocked with basic provisions. A coal oil lamp hung from a ceiling beam, which Lillian had already lit against the gloom. You've managed well, Vaughn observed, impressed by her practicality. Many women of his acquaintance would be in tears at their predicament, but Lillian seemed to take it in stride. I may have left Pennsylvania, Mr. Prescott, but I didn't leave my common sense behind, she replied with a small smile. The storm showed no signs of abating as evening approached. Rain lashed against the single window and wind howled around the cabin's sturdy corners. Vaughn built up the fire while Lillian brewed coffee in a battered pot found on the shelf. We might be here a while, Vaughn said, looking out at the darkening sky. These autumn storms sometimes last through the night. He saw concern flash across her face. That would be problematic. Understanding her meaning immediately, Vaughn nodded. For your reputation, you mean? The town has been welcoming, but they are also watching carefully to ensure their new teacher meets their standards of propriety, she said carefully. Being caught in a storm is unfortunate but explainable. Spending the night unchaperoned with a man, however, would likely cost you your position, Vaughn finished grimly. The frontier might be more forgiving of necessity than Eastern society, but certain standards remained, particularly for women in respected positions like teaching. We'll make for town as soon as there's a break in the weather, he promised. Even if it's the middle of the night. Lillian nodded gratefully, though both knew the storm might offer no such opportunity. As darkness fell outside, they sat at the small table sharing a simple meal assembled from the shack's provisions, beans warmed on the stove, hardtack softened in coffee, and dried apples. Their wet outer clothes hung near the stove to dry, leaving Lillian in her shirtwaist and Vaughn in his undershirt with a blanket draped around his shoulders. The enforced intimacy of their situation created a strange bubble of honesty between them. As the storm raged outside, they talked more openly than either had expected, sharing stories and thoughts usually kept private. Lillian spoke of her childhood in Pennsylvania, her love of teaching, and her hopes for building something meaningful in Cottonwood Springs. Vaughn found himself revealing more than he had to anyone in years, his dreams of someday having his own small ranch, his observations of the changing territories as settlers pushed ever westward, his private conviction that the days of the open range were numbered. "Why have you never settled in one place?" Lillian asked as the evening deepened. "You clearly understand ranching better than most. You could have established yourself years ago." The question struck at something Vaughn rarely examined. He stared into his coffee cup, searching for an answer that felt honest. "Settling means risking loss," he said finally. "Build something, claim it as yours, and you give the world a target. Drought, fire, fever, bad neighbors, something always comes for what you value." "So you choose to value nothing?" she asked softly, without judgment. "I choose freedom from that particular pain," he corrected. "Seen too many men broken not just by losing what they built, but by losing who they built it with." Lillian's gaze was steady across the table. "That sounds terribly lonely, Mr. Prescott." "Vaughn," he said suddenly, "if we're going to be stormbound together, might as well use my given name." A small smile curved her lips. "Vaughn," she repeated, "and I'm Lillian, though my students must call me Miss O'Connor." "Lillian," he said, testing the name. It felt right in his mouth as if he'd been waiting to speak it. "I understand choosing safety," she continued after a moment. "Truly I do, but I wonder if safety without connection is really living at all." "Says the woman who left everything familiar to start fresh among strangers," Vaughn observed. "Perhaps that's why I recognize the pattern," she replied. "I left to escape one kind of emptiness only to find another variety waiting. Building a life requires risk, doesn't it? Whether we acknowledge it or not." Her words struck him with unexpected force. Was that what he'd been doing all these years, not embracing freedom as he told himself but avoiding the risk of attachment? The possibility was uncomfortable enough that he rose from the table, moving to check the window. "Still coming down hard," he reported, changing the subject, "but the wind seems to be easing some." Lillian accepted the shift in conversation gracefully. "Should we try for town once the worst passes?" Vaughn considered the darkness outside. Creek might be running high with all this rain. Crossing in the dark would be risky, even if the rain stops. Might be safer to wait for first light. The implication hung between them. They would likely need to spend the night. Vaughn glanced at the single narrow cot, then at the floor near the stove. "I'll take the floor," he said firmly. "You should get some rest on the cot." Lillian looked as if she might protest, then nodded. "Thank you." They arranged what comfort they could with the available blankets. Vaughn insisted Lillian take the drier ones, fashioning himself a pallet near the stove where the floor was warmest. As they settled in for the night, the lamp extinguished to conserve oil, Vaughn found himself acutely aware of her presence across the small room, her breathing, the rustle of blankets as she adjusted her position, the faint scent of lavender that somehow persisted despite their drenching. "Vaughn," her voice came softly through the darkness. "Yes. Thank you for today, despite the storm. It was exactly what I needed." Something warm unfurled in his chest at her words. "My pleasure, Lillian. Good night." "Good night." As the storm gradually subsided outside and Lillian's breathing deepened into sleep, Vaughn lay awake, staring at the cabin's rough-hewn ceiling. For the first time in years, he found himself wondering what it might be like to stop drifting, to build something lasting, to risk the pain of loss for the possibility of something greater. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it filled him with a strange, quiet longing he couldn't remember feeling before. Dawn broke clear and cold, the storm having moved eastward during the night, leaving puddles and mud in its wake. They rose early, Vaughn stepping outside to check the horses while Lillian restored order to the cabin's interior. The creek had risen but remained crossable at the usual ford. By unspoken agreement, they set out for town immediately, hoping to reach Cottonwood Springs as morning church services began, when their arrival might attract less notice. They rode mostly in silence, both aware that their unexpected night away from town could have serious consequences for Lillian's reputation and position. As the buildings of Cottonwood Springs came into view, Vaughn noticed her posture straightening, her chin lifting in preparation for whatever confrontation might await. "Let me do the talking," he said as they approached the outskirts of town. "I'll explain about the storm." She glanced at him, surprised. "You don't need to involve yourself, Vaughn. This is my difficulty to manage." "We both know how these things go," he replied steadily. "A man caught in a storm is unfortunate. A woman in the same situation is subject to speculation. Let me at least try to shoulder some of it." Before she could respond, they rounded a bend in the road and came face to face with a search party, 4 men on horseback led by Marshal Donovan, with Edward Hargrove prominently among them. "Miss O'Connor," Hargrove called, spurring his horse forward. "Thank God you're safe. We've been searching since dawn." The banker's relieved expression darkened as he registered Vaughn's presence beside her. Marshal Donovan, a more practical man, simply looked them both over for signs of injury before nodding with visible relief. "Storm catch you out, did it?" the marshal asked, addressing his question to Vaughn rather than Lillian. "Yes, sir," Vaughn replied. "We sought shelter at the Sullivan Line shack until first light made travel safer. Creek was running too high to cross in the dark." Hargrove's face reddened. "You spent the night alone with Miss O'Connor in a line shack." The implication in his tone was unmistakable. Before Vaughn could respond, Lillian spoke, her voice clear and steady. "Mr. Hargrove, Mr. Prescott behaved as a perfect gentleman throughout what was an unfortunate situation caused entirely by weather. I would appreciate you not suggesting otherwise." The marshal cleared his throat. "No one suggesting anything, Miss O'Connor, just glad to find you safe. Mrs. Whittaker was beside herself with worry when you didn't return last evening." "I'll apologize to her immediately," Lillian said. "It was never my intention to cause concern." The group escorted them back to town, where a small crowd had gathered outside the boarding house. Whispers spread visibly as they approached, eyes darting between Lillian and Vaughn with undisguised curiosity. As they dismounted before the boarding house, Mrs. Whittaker rushed forward to embrace Lillian, her relief evident. Over the older woman's shoulder, Lillian's eyes met Vaughn's, communicating silent gratitude and something more complex, regret perhaps that their day of freedom had ended in such complications. "Mr. Prescott," Marshal Donovan said quietly as the women went inside, "a word, if you don't mind." The marshal led Vaughn a short distance away from the curious onlookers. "I believe your account of what happened," he said without preamble, "but you know how people talk. Miss O'Connor has a position to maintain in this community." "I understand," Vaughn replied, tension building in his shoulders. "Might be best if you kept your distance for a spell, let the talk die down naturally." Though phrased as a suggestion, Vaughn recognized it as something closer to an order. The message was clear. His presence would only complicate Lillian's standing in the community. If he cared for her welfare, he would step back. "I'll head back to the Sullivan Ranch," Vaughn agreed reluctantly. "Just wanted to make sure she got back safely." The marshal nodded satisfied. "Good man. I'll make sure the town council understands the situation was unavoidable. Miss O'Connor is well respected already. This shouldn't cause lasting damage if handled properly." As Vaughn mounted his horse to leave, he cast one last glance at the boarding house door through which Lillian had disappeared. An unexpected ache settled in his chest at the thought of not seeing her again, of returning to the solitary existence he had always claimed to prefer. For the first time in years, Vaughn Prescott rode away from town feeling not the relief of escaping civilization's constraints, but the hollow emptiness of leaving something valuable behind. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of ranch work as winter settled over the territory. Early snow blanketed the hills, and the cattle were moved to sheltered pastures closer to the main buildings. Vaughn threw himself into physical labor, volunteering for the most demanding tasks as if exertion could drive thoughts of Lillian from his mind. He avoided town entirely, sending personal supply requests with the Wednesday wagon rather than making the trip himself. From the driver, he gleaned occasional news that Miss O'Connor continued teaching, that the school would host a Christmas pageant in December, that the town's gossip had largely moved on to other matters. On the rare occasions when her name was mentioned among the ranch hands, Vaughn maintained careful neutrality, giving no indication of his personal interest. Yet each night as he lay in his bunk, her words returned to haunt him. "I wonder if safety without connection is really living at all." Had he been merely existing all these years, mistaking isolation for independence? The question plagued him, disrupting the contentment he had once found in his solitary life. December arrived with bitter cold and the promise of heavy snow. The Sullivan Ranch prepared for the coming Christmas festivities, with the rancher's wife planning a modest celebration for the hands who would remain through the holiday. Vaughn had no particular attachment to the season, having spent most Christmas days of his adult life on the trail or in unfamiliar bunkhouses. On the second Sunday of December, Ewan Sullivan approached Vaughn as he finished repairing a broken stall in the horse barn. "Need someone to drive the wagon to town tomorrow," Sullivan said without preamble. "Wife has Christmas parcels to send east, and Miller's down with that cough." Vaughn hesitated, aware this would mean breaking his self-imposed exile from Cottonwood Springs. "Harper could go," he suggested, naming another hand. Sullivan fixed him with a knowing look. "Reckon it should be you, Prescott. Been avoiding town long enough, haven't you?" Before Vaughn could formulate a response, Sullivan continued. "Whatever happened or didn't happen during that storm is nobody's business but yours. A man who runs from talk only feeds it." The simple wisdom in the rancher's words struck Vaughn forcefully. He had told himself he was staying away for Lillian's sake to protect her reputation, but wasn't he also protecting himself from the risk of deeper involvement? "I'll take the wagon," he agreed finally. The following morning dawned clear and cold as Vaughn set out for town, the wagon loaded with mail, supply requests, and Mrs. Sullivan's carefully wrapped Christmas packages. The journey gave him ample time to consider what, if anything, he would say if he encountered Lillian. Cottonwood Springs had transformed in his absence, with pine boughs decorating storefronts and red ribbons adorning the hitching posts along Main Street. As he guided the wagon toward Hobson's general store, Vaughn noticed a group of children playing in the schoolyard despite the cold, their laughter carrying clearly in the winter air. His business at the store took longer than expected, as Hobson insisted on reviewing each item on the ranch's supply list in detail. By the time Vaughn emerged, the short December day was already fading toward dusk. He was loading the last of the supplies when a familiar voice spoke behind him. "Mr. Prescott, what a surprise." He turned to find Lillian standing there, wrapped in a heavy wool coat, her cheeks flushed from the cold. Something in his chest tightened at the sight of her. "Miss O'Connor," he greeted her formally, conscious of the curious glances from passers-by. "Hope you're keeping well." "Quite well, thank you." Her tone matched his in polite distance, but her eyes held questions. "I haven't seen you in town recently." "Ranch keeps me busy," he offered, the excuse sounding hollow even to his own ears. She nodded as if this explained everything, though they both knew it didn't. An awkward silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken words. "The children are preparing a Christmas pageant," she said finally. "This Friday evening at the school. The whole town is invited." "I heard," Vaughn replied. "I'm sure it will be a fine event." Another silence fell. Vaughn searched for something to say that might bridge the careful distance between them, but nothing seemed adequate. "Well, I should let you finish your work," Lillian said after a moment. "Good day, Mr. Prescott." She turned to go, and Vaughn felt a sudden desperation, as if something vital were slipping away, something he couldn't afford to lose. "Lillian," he said, forgetting propriety in his urgency. "I stayed away because the marshal suggested it would be better for your standing in town, not because I wanted to." She paused, turning back to face him. "And what is it that you want, Vaughn?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. What did he want? The safe, solitary existence he'd maintained for years, or something riskier and potentially more fulfilling? "I'm not entirely sure," he admitted honestly, "but I know I've thought about you every day since that storm." A small smile touched her lips. "I've thought about you too." Hope surged through him, warming him despite the December chill. "Would it cause too much talk if I attended your Christmas pageant Friday?" "Probably," she acknowledged, "but I find I'm less concerned about town gossip than I once was." "I would be pleased if you came." The simplicity of her statement, the quiet courage it represented, moved him deeply. This woman who had traveled alone across the country to build a new life understood the value of taking risks for what mattered. "Then I'll be there," he promised. As she walked away, Vaughn felt something shift inside him, a decision forming, not yet fully articulated but growing stronger with each beat of his heart. The solitary path he had followed for so long no longer seemed inevitable or even desirable. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine a different future. The ranch hands were surprised when Vaughn announced his intention to attend the school Christmas pageant that Friday evening, but Sullivan merely nodded as if he had expected nothing less. Vaughn spent an unprecedented amount of time on his appearance, borrowing a proper coat from Harper and polishing his boots until they shone. The schoolhouse was transformed when he arrived, pine boughs decorating every surface and candles providing warm illumination against the winter darkness. Nearly the entire town had turned out for the event, filling the small building to capacity. Vaughn slipped in quietly, taking a position at the back where he could observe without drawing undue attention. The children performed admirably, reciting Christmas poems and singing carols with varying degrees of skill but genuine enthusiasm. Throughout the performance, Vaughn found his gaze drawn repeatedly to Lillian as she guided her students through their roles, her face alight with pride and pleasure in their achievements. When the final carol concluded and the audience erupted in applause, Vaughn watched as parents surrounded Lillian, offering congratulations and thanks. Edward Hargrove was among them, presenting her with an elaborate bouquet that she accepted with polite gratitude but no particular warmth. Vaughn waited patiently as the crowd gradually thinned, families departing with sleepy children in tow. Finally, as the last parent left and Lillian began extinguishing candles, he approached. "That was quite a performance," he said, startling her slightly. "You've done wonders with those children in such a short time." Her smile was radiant as she turned toward him. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't certain you would." "I said I would," he replied simply. They stood in the half-darkened schoolroom, the remaining candles casting a golden glow over her features. Vaughn was struck anew by her beauty, but even more by the strength and determination that had brought her to this place, this life she was building far from everything familiar. "May I walk you home?" he asked. She nodded, gathering her shawl. They stepped out into the crisp December night, stars brilliant overhead in the clear sky. The boardwalk was largely deserted, most townspeople having retreated to the warmth of their homes. They walked in companionable silence for a time, their breath forming small clouds in the cold air. Vaughn found himself acutely aware of her presence beside him, of the slight brush of her skirts against his legs as they walked. "Will you stay through Christmas at the Sullivan Ranch?" she asked eventually. "That's the plan," he replied, "though I haven't given much thought to after." "No, I thought cowboys always plan their next move carefully." "Some things a man can't plan," Vaughn said, gathering his courage. "Some things change the course you thought you were on." She glanced at him, her expression thoughtful in the moonlight. "What things?" "Meeting someone who makes you question everything you thought you knew about yourself," he answered honestly. "Someone who shows you there might be more to life than just surviving alone." They had reached the small house attached to the school, where Lillian now lived. She stopped at the gate, turning to face him fully. "Are you saying I've changed your course, Vaughn Prescott?" "I'm saying you've made me want to change it," he admitted. "And that terrifies me almost as much as it excites me." The vulnerability in his confession hung between them in the winter air. Lillian studied his face, her expression softening. "I understand fear," she said quietly. "I was terrified when I left Pennsylvania, terrified on that stagecoach, terrified when I found myself alone on that road at dusk, but fear doesn't mean we're making the wrong choice. Sometimes it means exactly the opposite." Before Vaughn could respond, the door of a nearby house opened, spilling lamplight onto the street. The reminder of watchful eyes broke the moment between them. "I should go in," Lillian said, though she made no move to do so. "Yes," Vaughn agreed reluctantly. "It's getting late." Still, they lingered at the gate, neither willing to end the evening. "The Christmas Eve service is next Sunday," Lillian said finally. "Would you consider attending? They say it's quite beautiful, with the church all decorated and lit only by candles." The invitation represented more than a simple church service. It was an acknowledgement of whatever was growing between them, a willingness to let others see it too. "I'd be honored," Vaughn replied, meaning it. "Good night then," she said softly. "Good night, Lillian." As he watched her enter her home, Vaughn felt a certainty settle over him, that the solitary path he had followed for so long was coming to an end, and that the new direction, though uncertain and frightening in its possibilities, was the only one that now made sense. The week before Christmas brought heavy snow to Sweetgrass County, transforming the landscape into a vast white expanse broken only by the dark shapes of buildings and trees. Despite the difficult travel conditions, Vaughn made the journey to Cottonwood Springs twice, once with the regular supply wagon and again, to his own surprise, to deliver a small gift he had crafted for Lillian. Working by lamplight in the ranch's tack room, he had fashioned a simple but elegant bookmark from a piece of soft leather, carefully tooling a pattern of wildflowers along its length. It was a modest gift, but one he hoped would please her, knowing her love of books. He presented it to her after school hours, awkwardly explaining that he had noticed her marking pages with scraps of paper during their conversations. Her delight at the simple gift was genuine, her fingers tracing the pattern with appreciation for the workmanship. "It's beautiful, Vaughn," she said warmly. "Thank you." "It's not much," he demurred. "It's perfect," she insisted. "And it means more knowing you made it yourself." That evening, as they shared coffee in her small sitting room, the door left conspicuously open to avoid gossip, Lillian spoke of her plans for the school, her hopes of establishing a proper library, perhaps even expanding to a second classroom as the town grew. "You see yourself staying here then?" Vaughn asked, trying to keep his tone casual. "Making Cottonwood Springs your home permanently?" "I believe I do," she replied thoughtfully. "It wasn't what I expected when I first arrived, but this place and its people have become important to me. There's something rewarding about building something meaningful, about belonging to a community." Her words resonated with thoughts that had been forming in Vaughn's mind since their reunion, half-formed dreams he had barely allowed himself to acknowledge. "I've been thinking," he said carefully, "about what comes after winter, about not joining a cattle drive come spring." Lillian looked up sharply. "Oh. Sullivan mentioned there's land available east of his property, good water, decent grazing. Nothing fancy but enough for a man to start something of his own." He paused, gathering courage, if he were of a mind to put down roots. The implication hung between them, unspoken but clear. Lillian set her coffee cup down slowly. "And are you of such a mind, Vaughn?" "I'm beginning to think I might be," he admitted, "for the right reasons." Their eyes met across the small table, the connection between them almost tangible in its intensity. Before either could speak further, however, a knock at the open door interrupted the moment. Mrs. Whittaker stood there, her expression carefully neutral. "Evening, Miss O'Connor, Mr. Prescott. Just wanted to let you know I've put on a fresh pot of coffee, if you'd care to join me in the kitchen." The invitation was clearly meant as a reminder of propriety rather than a genuine offer of refreshment. Vaughn took the hint, rising from his chair. "Thank you, ma'am, but I should be heading back to the ranch before the snow gets any deeper." As he prepared to leave, gathering his hat and coat, Lillian walked with him to the door. "Christmas Eve service is at 7, she reminded him softly. "I'll save you a seat." The promise carried him through the cold ride back to the Sullivan Ranch, warming him more effectively than any fire could have done. Christmas Eve arrived with perfect winter weather, clear skies, brilliant stars, and snow that crunched satisfyingly underfoot. Vaughn spent the afternoon helping prepare the ranch for the holiday, then bathed and dressed with unprecedented care for the evening service. The small church was transformed when he arrived, pine branches and red ribbons decorating every surface, dozens of candles creating a warm golden glow. Nearly every resident of Cottonwood Springs and the surrounding area had crowded into the building, their festive attire and cheerful greetings creating an atmosphere of genuine celebration. Vaughn hesitated at the entrance, suddenly aware of his status as an outsider in this close-knit community. Then he saw Lillian, seated near the middle of the church, turn and scan the doorway. When her eyes found his, her face brightened with a smile of such genuine pleasure that his uncertainty vanished. He made his way to where she sat, aware of curious glances, but focusing only on the welcome in her expression. "You came," she said as he settled beside her. "I said I would," he replied, echoing their exchange after the children's pageant. The service was simple but moving, familiar carols sung with heartfelt enthusiasm, scripture readings by community members, and a brief sermon about finding light in darkness. Throughout, Vaughn was acutely aware of Lillian beside him, of the occasional brush of her shoulder against his, of the way candlelight played across her features. As the final carol concluded and people began to disperse, many stopping to exchange Christmas greetings, Vaughn noticed Edward Hargrove approaching with clear purpose. The banker's expression darkened slightly at finding Vaughn still at Lillian's side, but he maintained a polite facade. "Miss O'Connor," Hargrove greeted her warmly. "A lovely service, wasn't it? My sister and I would be honored if you would join us for Christmas dinner tomorrow, just a small gathering of friends to celebrate the holiday." Before Lillian could respond, Mrs. Sullivan appeared beside them, her round face flushed with holiday cheer. "Miss O'Connor, just the person I was looking for," she exclaimed. "I wanted to personally invite you to join us for Christmas dinner at the ranch tomorrow. Nothing fancy but plenty of good food and company. Mr. Prescott will be there, of course, along with our other hands." The timing of the invitation was so perfect it almost seemed planned, leaving both Lillian and Hargrove momentarily speechless. Vaughn suspected Mrs. Sullivan, a perceptive woman, had observed more than she let on during his recent trips to town. Lillian recovered first, turning to Hargrove with genuine regret. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Hargrove. As you can see, I've already received an invitation, perhaps another time." The banker's disappointment was evident, though he maintained his composure. "Of course, another time," with a stiff nod to Mrs. Sullivan and a barely perceptible glance at Vaughn, he retreated to join his sister. "So you'll come?" Mrs. Sullivan asked eagerly. "We'd be so pleased to have you. Dinner's at 2, but folks usually start arriving earlier." "I would be delighted," Lillian replied, her eyes meeting Vaughn's with barely concealed delight at this unexpected turn of events. After the church emptied, Vaughn walked Lillian home through the silent, snow-covered streets. The night was perfect, crisp and clear, with stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky. "That was a fortunate coincidence," Lillian observed, amusement coloring her tone, Mrs. Sullivan's invitation arriving at precisely that moment. Vaughn chuckled softly. "Mrs. Sullivan doesn't miss much. I suspect she's been watching more closely than either of us realized." They reached Lillian's gate, pausing in the moonlight that transformed the simple schoolhouse into something magical with its snow-covered roof and windows glowing with lamplight. "I have something for you," Vaughn said, reaching into his coat pocket. "Not much of a Christmas gift, but I wanted you to have it." He withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Lillian accepted it with surprise. "But I've already received your beautiful bookmark," she protested. "This is different," he said simply. "Open it." She carefully untied the string and unwrapped the paper to reveal a small wooden box, polished to a soft sheen. Opening it, she found a pressed wildflower, a perfect prairie rose, its delicate pink petals preserved between two pieces of glass bound with copper wire. "It's from the ridge where we rode that day," Vaughn explained, "before the storm. I found it when I went back a week later, thought you might like a reminder of the view." Lillian traced the glass with one finger, her expression soft in the moonlight. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Thank you." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken feelings. Vaughn took a deep breath, gathering his courage. "Lillian, I need to tell you something," he began. "That day on the ridge when we talked about why I never stayed in one place, about valuing nothing so I wouldn't risk losing it, you were right. I wasn't really living, just existing. Moving from job to job, place to place, never allowing myself to care too deeply about anything or anyone." She remained silent, listening intently as he continued. "But then I saw you walking alone at dusk and something changed. I still don't fully understand it, but I know I'm not the same man who rode down that ridge that evening. I don't want to be alone anymore. I want to build something lasting, and I want," he paused, gathering his courage, "I want to build it with you if you're willing." The words hung in the cold night air between them, the most vulnerable Vaughn had allowed himself to be in years. Lillian's eyes searched his face, looking for certainty. "Are you sure?" she asked softly. "This isn't just a moment of holiday sentiment." "I've never been more sure of anything," he replied simply. "I love you, Lillian O'Connor. I think I started falling in love with you the moment I saw you on that road, facing down the wilderness with nothing but courage and determination." A smile bloomed across her face, radiant in the moonlight. "And I love you, Vaughn Prescott, despite all my rational arguments against entangling my heart again so soon, despite the risk and uncertainty. I love you." The confession sent warmth flooding through Vaughn's chest, melting the last of the ice that had protected his heart for so long. Gently, he reached for her hand, entwining their fingers in the space between them. "I don't have much to offer yet," he said honestly, "but if you can be patient while I get established, build something worthy of you." "Worthy of us," she corrected gently. "Whatever we build, we'll build together." Their first kiss, when it came, was gentle and tentative, a promise exchanged beneath the stars on Christmas Eve. As Vaughn held her close, the vast Montana sky spreading endlessly above them, he marveled at how completely his world had changed since that autumn evening when he'd seen her walking alone at dusk. The solitary path he had followed for so long had led him, unexpectedly but perfectly, to her, and in finding her, he had found his way home. Christmas Day at the Sullivan Ranch was everything a frontier celebration should be, warm, boisterous, and filled with genuine goodwill. Lillian arrived mid-morning, brought by the ranch foreman who had been sent to town for last-minute supplies. Her reception was enthusiastic, particularly from Mrs. Sullivan, who embraced her as if she were already family. Throughout the day, Vaughn watched with quiet joy as Lillian charmed everyone from the crusty old cook to Sullivan's shy youngest daughter. She fit seamlessly into the ranch's Christmas traditions, helping with final dinner preparations, joining in carols around the piano, and listening with genuine interest to the hands' frontier stories. When dinner was served, a feast of roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, and Mrs. Sullivan's famous apple pies, Vaughn found himself seated beside Lillian at the long table. Under the tablecloth, her hand found his briefly, a silent acknowledgement of their shared secret. After the meal, as twilight gathered and folks settled into comfortable conversations around the fire, Sullivan drew Vaughn aside. "That land east of here we discussed," the rancher said without preamble. "I've been thinking on it, might be willing to sell you a parcel come spring if you're still interested. Good terms, nothing due until after your first season." Vaughn stared at him, momentarily speechless. The offer was extraordinarily generous, the kind rarely extended to a drifting cowhand with limited resources. "That's more than fair," he managed finally. "Why would you do that?" Sullivan's weathered face creased in a knowing smile. "Been watching you work these past months. You've got a good head for cattle and an honest way about you. Territory needs more men putting down roots, building something lasting." His gaze shifted briefly to where Lillian sat by the fire, engaged in animated conversation with Mrs. Sullivan. "Besides, seems to me you might have found a reason to stay." The perceptiveness of the observation brought heat to Vaughn's face, but he didn't deny it. "Yes, sir, I believe I have." "Good," Sullivan said simply. "We'll talk details after the new year." As darkness fell completely and the time came for Lillian to return to town, Vaughn offered to drive her himself. The night was clear and cold, stars brilliant overhead as they traveled the snow-packed road in Sullivan's best cutter sleigh, warm blankets tucked around them against the winter chill. "Sullivan offered to sell me land," Vaughn told her as they glided through the silent, snow-covered landscape. "A good parcel east of the ranch, said he'd give me reasonable terms." Lillian's face brightened with genuine pleasure. "Vaughn, that's wonderful. When would you begin?" "After the spring thaw, if all goes as planned." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "It won't be much at first, just a small cabin, some cattle to start a herd." "Nothing like what you had back east." "What I had back east was a beautiful cage," she replied softly. "What you're describing is freedom, a chance to build something meaningful together." The simplicity of her acceptance, her willingness to embrace the challenging frontier life because they would face it together, filled Vaughn with humbling gratitude. "It won't be easy," he cautioned. "Frontier ranching is hard work, especially starting from scratch." "I've never been afraid of hard work," she reminded him, "and nothing worthwhile comes easily." They reached the outskirts of town, the sleigh runners cutting smoothly through the untouched snow. Before they came within sight of the first buildings, Vaughn reined the horses to a stop, turning to face Lillian in the starlight. "I want to do this properly," he said, reaching into his pocket. "I don't have a fancy ring yet, but I need to ask, Lillian O'Connor, will you marry me? Will you build a life with me, face whatever comes together?" In answer, she reached up to frame his face with her gloved hands, drawing him down for a kiss that conveyed everything words could not. When they finally parted, both breathless in the cold air, she smiled up at him. "Yes, Vaughn Prescott, I will marry you." The simple words held all the promise Vaughn had never dared hope for, a future not spent in solitary wandering, but in building something lasting with the woman he loved. As they continued toward town, the horses' bells jingling merrily in the winter night, he felt a profound sense of homecoming unlike anything he had ever known. Spring came to Montana Territory in fits and starts, snow melting to reveal tender green shoots, only to be covered again by late blizzards. By April, however, the promise of new beginnings could no longer be denied. The land emerged from winter's grip, creeks swelled with snowmelt, and birds returned to build nests in greening trees. On the first truly warm Sunday in May 1886, Vaughn Prescott stood before the altar in Cottonwood Springs' small church, watching as Lillian O'Connor walked toward him on the arm of Ewan Sullivan, who had offered to stand in place of her distant father. She wore a simple gown of ivory satin, her chestnut hair crowned with wildflowers gathered that morning from the ridge where they had first begun to know each other. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, witnessed by the entire community that had come to embrace them both. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Vaughn felt a sense of rightness, of completion that had eluded him throughout his years of wandering. After the celebration, a joyous affair held on the Sullivan Ranch with food, music, and dancing that continued well into the evening, they rode together to their new home. The cabin Vaughn had built through late winter and early spring waited for them, situated on a gentle rise overlooking a meandering creek and the beginnings of their small herd grazing in the distance. Inside, Vaughn had prepared everything as best he could: simple furniture crafted by his own hands, curtains sewn by Mrs. Sullivan, a collection of books donated by the town for their teacher's new home. It was modest by any standard, but as Lillian explored each room, her face shone with genuine delight. "It's perfect," she declared, turning to embrace him. "Our home." Later, as they stood together on the porch watching the last light fade from the western sky, Vaughn's arm around Lillian's waist, he marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. "I still can't believe how much my life has changed since I saw you walking alone that evening," he said softly. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd just kept writing." Lillian leaned into his embrace, her head resting against his shoulder. "I don't believe that was ever a possibility," she replied. "Some things are meant to be, even if we don't recognize them at first." The simple wisdom of her words resonated deeply. Whether fate, providence, or simple good fortune, Vaughn knew with absolute certainty that stopping for a lone woman at dusk had been the most important decision of his life. "Ride with me," he had said that evening. "You're not alone." Little had he known then that in offering companionship to a stranger, he had found the end of his own isolation, that together they would build a life neither of them could have imagined alone. As darkness settled over their new home and the first stars appeared in the vast Montana sky, Vaughn Prescott held his wife close, no longer a drifting cowboy but a man with roots, purpose, and a love that had transformed everything.